All right, ladies and gentlemen, why don't we get things moving here? On behalf of the neighbors of the Scituate Industrial Wind Turbine, I'd like to thank all of you for attending on short notice, I'm sure, in a lot of cases, this education and advocacy event. We decided as a community group to organize this to allow folks that possibly haven't been following the story that closely over these past few months or haven't had the ability to follow the story or frankly just haven't been directly impacted and that interested up until now. We thought we would provide a forum for folks to be able to come and get some information. And how's that? Is that better? Yeah. So we wanted to have an event that we could host and invite some industry experts so folks could better appreciate the issue, the health impacts that your neighbors and your friends have been experiencing since the industrial wind turbine was operational and commissioned, and to allow you to ask some questions and hopefully draw your own conclusions based on the real issue and what folks have been experiencing since the wind turbine was in operation in 2012, about a year ago. For those of you that have been following the story, of course, it's been a very one-sided debate in a lot of cases in terms of some misinformation that's been directed to people either personally, through certain town events or through the media, and one of the reasons that we wanted to get people together today was to try and dispel some of those notions. So I very much thank all of you for attending on a beautiful Saturday afternoon. We've had some incredible weather this winter, and there would be all kinds of great reasons to be doing something other than sitting here listening to me on a Saturday. So we very much appreciate you attending. So I guess sort of the first part is how did we get here? What's sort of the bit of the background on all of this? Well, in 2007, the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources and the Massachusetts Executive Office of Environmental Affairs issued a model ordinance or bylaw that may be modified and adopted as necessary by local governments that want to promote wind energy development. In 2009, those entities amended the model ordinance to cover both small and large wind developments and to incorporate as-of-right siting, which we'll get into in a little bit. But what that basically means is that as long as developments follow the local, state, and federal laws, they are allowed. And there were some additional adjustments that were made to the program in June of 2011. But essentially, what this right of siting allows communities to do is that once locations are designated within a local jurisdiction, a wind development may proceed without the need for any special permits whatsoever. Now, since 2008, 86 cities have received the Green Communities designation. And what this means, it's really all about the money. They automatically receive a first-year grant, which is a minimum of $125,000. And then there are additional incentives along the way, and those numbers can increase depending on population size. And again, some of the requirements of this include that those communities must agree to provide as-of-right siting in designated locations for renewable and alternative energy installations. And by adopting this designation, this allows these communities to expedite the application and permit process for as-of-right energy facilities. An expedited, hot-wired approval process. So in the ordinance, as-of-right siting is defined in the model ordinance as a development that may proceed without the need for a special permit, variance, amendment, waiver, or other discretionary approval. So essentially, what that allows an as-of-right development, as long as they're consistent with zoning bylaws and with state and federal law, they cannot be prohibited, regardless of location. They cannot be prohibited. So theoretically, a wind development could be located within 650 feet of a residential house, which just seems absolutely outrageous. But that's exactly what's happened here in Scituate, as evidenced by the location of the turbine and certain folks that live on the driftway. This isn't an issue that impacts people that only live 650 feet away. We have residents in our community that live 3,500 feet away, 3,000 feet away that are directly impacted by the acoustics emanating from the industrial wind turbine, and in some cases, shadow flicker. So that's sort of the background in terms of the regulation and the potential permitting processes and the reduced restrictions that wind developers need to meet to get these things up and running. So how does that apply to the Scituate case study? Well, as we all know, with very little fanfare and information, we went through a permitting process here in Scituate, largely unbeknownst to most folks, that ultimately culminated in the approval of this industrial wind turbine. And with great fanfare, in March of 2012, the industrial wind turbine that you could see throughout that window was commissioned and commenced operation. What happened then? People started to experience health-related issues. People were starting to be impacted because of lack of sleep. They were experiencing other things such as headaches. In some cases, we've seen examples of migraines. We've seen children that have been impacted and not able to perform at school, such as they were able to prior to the commissioning of the turbine. But people suffered quietly for the first few months. It wasn't until we got into the late spring, early summer that people started to discuss this issue amongst themselves, and we started to realize that there was some real consistent themes on the health-related situation and the timing of when some of those health issues were starting to take place. So due to some great due diligence and initiative by one of our neighbors, Mr. David Darty, who couldn't be here today but asked me to pass on his best to everyone, there was a meeting that was undertaken in front of the Board of Health in the latter part of September of 2012 to bring forward this issue that people were experiencing health-related impacts as a result of the inappropriate siting of this industrial wind turbine in close proximity to a residential neighborhood. Why did we go to the Board of Health? The Board of Health is mandated by both the town and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to protect the health and safety of its residents. And if there is an issue that is creating health and safety issues for members of the town, the Board of Health has the ability by statute to shut that turbine down. So what we did with the coordinated effort of Mr. Darty and others was we encouraged residents who were legitimately experiencing health impacts as a result of this to file complaint forms, emails, getting into some very personal detail as to what they are experiencing from a health perspective since this turbine was operational. In the middle of October, we formally asked the Board of Health to shut the turbine down by the middle of November, November the 14th. It was during that Board of Health meeting that in lieu of making a decision to shut the turbine down, that the Board of Health decided to commission a steering committee to create a scope of work for a study. Now, Mr. Jerry Kelly and I, of 56 Moreland Road, we volunteered to sit on that steering committee and try to develop a scope of work that accurately reflected what was occurring here. So you may have read in media reports that we asked for a three-pronged, multifaceted study on this particular issue. The first component was we asked for not a narrow acoustical study, such as the one that was espoused by the wind developer, but a much broader study that would focus on things like low-frequency sound, infrasound, an animal called aerodynamic amplitude modulation. My God, a year ago did I ever think I'd know anything about aerodynamic amplitude modulation. The wind developer, understanding that if we were to obtain parameters of a study that broad, that the data coming off that would not reflect well on the performance of the wind turbine and would support some of the issues that we've been experiencing from a health and safety perspective. Additionally, we asked that that study incorporate shadow flicker. Now, shadow flicker, and you'll see in a moment an actual case study, is essentially a strobe-like effect that people experience outside and inside their homes when the sunlight, when going directly through the blades of the turbine, creates a strobe-like effect that you would see on Dance Fever. Now, it's one thing to enjoy that on TV or go to a club. It's something else entirely to have that rolling through your house on a daily basis when the sun comes out. The permit that was issued for this particular wind turbine stipulated, due to some faulty modeling that took place, that shadow flicker in any particular situation or residence should not occur for more than 30 hours per year. And you'll hear a story where we have a family in our community that experiences, in some instances, 2 to 3 hours of shadow flicker a day. Now, if you discount that even by 50%, so you allow for no sun, what have you, you can do the math and easily get to a place where that family is experiencing shadow flicker that goes well beyond 30 hours per day. And then the third and final component of the study that we wanted to, that we espoused and wanted the Board of Health to embrace was a health questionnaire, because really we were there for health and safety issues. Some of the complaint forms and the emails and the very personal health information that people were presenting to the Board of Health were being discounted and set aside. So what we said was, let's engage the services of a physician that specializes in sleep and stress-related illnesses, allow them to incorporate a confidential health questionnaire for people that were directly impacted, and they, on a confidential basis, could tell their story and exactly what they were experiencing and why it was creating health difficulties for them. And, of course, the wind developer didn't want any part of that either. So what we now have, on January the 28th of this year, Mr. Kelly and I, on behalf of the community group, made a recommendation for this much broader approach that we've been espousing. The wind developer took a much narrower view that was focused only on the acoustical side and the limited component of it, no shadow flicker, no health-related issues. And the Board of Health not only agreed to take that much leaner approach, they also provided the wind developer with the mandate to create the request for proposal document. Now, even the most disinterested bystander must understand the impropriety of that. So this is where we are today. We have been before the Board of Selectmen. We have been before the Board of Health. We have tried to disseminate as accurate information as we possibly could during this process, and hence the culmination of activities that lead us to, as a community, get together today to better understand this particular issue. So that's the background. That's where we are, and we will have questions at the end. So if anything, please note that, and then we'll roll through our speakers list first, and then we'll get to some Q&A towards the end. So I very much appreciate your time in allowing me to describe exactly what we are dealing with here. Our first speaker is a gentleman by the name of Mr. Rick James. Rick was not able to join us personally because he has to head out to western part of the continent tomorrow, but he wanted to be part of this program, and we were able to work through a Skype presentation, so that's why you'll be viewing him on the screen. Mr. James is the owner and principal consultant for an organization by the name of E-Coustic Solutions. Mr. James has been practicing acoustical engineering for 40 years now. He started his career as an acoustical engineer working for the Chevrolet division of General Motors Corporation in the early 1970s. And his client list includes large manufacturing firms such as General Motors, Ford, Goodyear Tire and Rubber, and others who have manufacturing facilities, community noise, and worker noise exposure. He has been actively involved in the Institute of Noise Control Engineers since it was formed in the early 1970s. His academic credentials include appointments as adjunct professor and instructor to the Speech and Communication Science departments at Michigan State University and Central Michigan University. Rick, I don't know how we time this, but we're all missing the Michigan game, but you'll be done in time to catch the Michigan State game later on. Specific to wind turbine noise, he has worked for clients in over 60 different communities and has provided written and oral testimony in approximately 30 of those cases. He has also authored or co-authored 4 papers covering wind turbine noise topics, including how to set criteria for wind turbine projects that will protect public health, demonstrating that wind turbine sound emissions are predominantly comprised of infra and low frequency sound, such as I mentioned earlier on, and a peer-reviewed historical review of other types of low-frequency noise sources with similar sound emission characteristics and other noise sources that have been known adverse health effects on people exposed to their sound. Mr. James' credentials are in question, and his knowledge in this space is on question, and we are delighted to have him. Rick, I will turn it over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, well, thank you, Tom. That was a great introduction. I couldn't have written it better myself. Am I coming through okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay, well, greetings from Michigan. Actually, Skype is also a wonderful opportunity to lower the carbon footprint. It's a lot less, call it carbon load, when all I have to do is log on to Skype. So let me start going over to the slideshow here. It'll just take me a second. Okay, we should be looking at the title slide. What we're here to talk about today is Wind Turbine Acoustics 101. 25 minutes isn't enough time to introduce acoustics as a physics course, but what I like to do is introduce you to the basic concepts necessary to understand the debate. Whenever a new noise source is introduced into a community, there's always concerns. This is what land use planning is about. As a general rule, wind turbines don't fit into the normal parameters for community noise sources. And that's one of the reasons why when we apply standard techniques like the Massachusetts DEP's test, which is focusing on A-weighted sounds, a noise source can appear to be compatible and yet end up with adverse results, as Mr. Thompson has just been describing. Kind of think of it this way. If the community is a nice calm surface on a pond, the new noise source is a stone tossed into it, and the sound coming off of the new noise source are the ripples. The only real difference is that a stone, when it's tossed in, just produces ripples in 2 dimensions, whereas sound waves produce spherical waves coming in all 3 directions. We also use the basic concept of decibels. The dB scale is necessary because the range of hearing from the quietest sounds to the noisiest sounds is so great that we use a logarithmic scale to compress that into a reasonable set of numbers, essentially from about 0 decibels up to about 120 decibels. And for all practical purposes, from the quietest rural communities, 20 decibels to about 120 decibels, near something like a very noisy airport runway. We have 2 different types of sounds or descriptors. One is the acoustic output of a noise source. Let's go backwards. And that's in watts. That's called sound power. When we get data from a manufacturer on a wind turbine, we'll normally see it referred to as the LW, or the level referenced in watts. And this is the total power output, similar to if you bought a 70-watt bulb or a 40-watt bulb. You know the difference in relative illumination. However, where you put that light makes a difference. If you put a 40-watt bulb in a black room, it doesn't provide much light, where if you put a 40-watt bulb in a room painted white, it would appear brighter, and that's the illumination level, which is dependent upon the environment the source is located in. And for acoustics, we call that sound pressure. That's the sound that reaches our ears. It's measured in decibels again, but this time it's the pressure received at the receiving location. We might call it L sub P for pressure. L sub N is a statistical indicator. If it's an overall reading of all frequencies, dBA or dBc. If it's a narrow frequency we're looking at, we might call it SPL for sound pressure level. But that is the result of the initial sound power having propagated through a community and interacted with the various agents that would cause it to be less at a greater distance. Now, that's a big issue here. As a general rule, most community noise sources are dominated by mid and high frequency sound. When you have a noise source with mid to high frequency sound, the sound drops off about 6 decibels. So if we have a person listening to a wind turbine at 1,000 feet, we might get 45 dBA. If we're listening to it at 2,000 feet, 39 dBA. And at 4,000 feet, 33 dBA. Now, one of the points I want to make here is once we get to distances of 2,000 feet or 4,000 feet, you have to double that distance again to get a significant drop. So if there's a problem at 2,000 feet, then it'll probably be an issue for the people for the next 1,000 or more feet. If it was a problem at 4,000, we'd have to be out at over 1.25 miles to get a significant reduction. And more importantly, if the noise source has significant low frequency sound, it drops off at a rate of 3. So then we would have had 1,000 feet is 45, 2,000 feet would have only been 42, and 4,000 feet would have been 39. And again, as I'm going to show you, wind turbine noise is predominantly low frequency and infrasound. One of the reasons for that difference is the lower the frequency, the longer the wavelength, the longer the physical size of the acoustic pressure wave is. If we're talking about a 200 hertz tone or sound, something that you might hear from a large industrial fan, that wavelength is about the height of a person, or the height of a person. But when we start talking about low frequency sound, those frequencies.
Rick, we lost you there, buddy.
My point here was that the physical size of the low frequency wave becomes so large that obstacles like walls, windows, roofs that normally block the sound from higher frequencies no longer work that way, and thus low frequency sounds become more of a problem indoors than they are outdoors. There's 2 different ways that we can perceive sound. The common one that we're most familiar with and think about is auditory perception. That basically is this part of the organ, the cochlea, and its function is to transfer the low to high frequency sound, for which it's tuned, into nerve impulses that go to the brain along one set of nerves. But we also have another organ in that same cluster, which is the vestibular organs, the organs of Corti. And what has been learned in the past few years is that these organs can also I just noticed you ducked down there, I didn't know if it was a problem. These organs also can sense sounds, particularly infrasound and low frequency sound. The difference is that rather than hearing them, they're felt. It's a physical sensation, maybe stuffiness in the ear, it may be motion sickness, it can come from a variety of different symptom types, but they're all from stimulation of this organ by this acoustic energy. That research that I was talking about is demonstrated in this chart. This is a graph by Dr. Alex Salt, published about 2 years ago, in which he used infrasonic pulses to determine when the nerves output the vestibular perception, which in this case at 10 hertz might occur at 60 decibels, versus when the nerves that take auditory information to the brain are stimulated. And so the difference in threshold between the vestibular threshold and the auditory threshold is almost 30 decibels at this point. So a sound, in order for you to hear the rumble, the sound would have to be up at 80 to 90 decibels, but you will start feeling it at 60 to 65 decibels. And this is the part that's been overlooked in almost all of the new regulations on wind turbines. Wind turbine energy is in this range, as we'll see. Now, another aspect is when a new noise source is introduced into a community, how much does it vary from the other community noises? If it's only about 1 decibel louder, Nobody's going to notice it. If it's 3 decibels, it might just be perceptible. If it's 5, it's noticeable but not objectionable. And at 10, it sounds twice as loud and begins to become objectionable. At 20 decibels, it's 4 times as loud, and at that point, it's very much the dominant noise source in the community. But this is for mid and high frequency sounds. What if the sound coming from the new noise source has most of its energy below 125 hertz? We use elephants here as an example because that's the region in which their trumpeting and communication works best. Well, in that case, our auditory system was much more sensitive. Whereas it took 5 decibels to be noticeable for mid and high frequency sounds, it only takes 3 decibels for low frequency, for rumble. In order to make it twice as loud, 5 decibel increase, whereas it was over a 6 decibel increase before. And at 10 decibels louder, it sounds 4 times as loud. And what this really means is that it does not take much low frequency sound for someone to go from I can barely hear it to it sounds very loud to me. And this is one of the issues with low frequency complaints, is that it does not, the noise does not have to exceed the criteria by very much for the person listening to it to perceive it as extremely loud. Now, when we talk about a sound level meter, there's many different makes and varieties, but they have 2 primary functions. One is to look at the complete frequency of sound. Here we go from 10 hertz, the infrasonic region, up to the clicks and hisses of a high frequency sound. We can put a filter on called A weighting, which if we follow the red curve, we can see de-emphasizes all of the low frequency sound and focuses primarily on this region, which is speech frequency. B weighting is a standard, but it's very seldom used. C weighting is the common alternative, and we can see that that reports the total sound fairly reliably through this range from about 100 hertz up to about 8,000 hertz. But below 100 hertz, it also de-emphasizes the sound. The other function of a sound level meter is to break the sound up into individual octave bands. I think the easiest way to see this is the way a prism will take white light, which is a mixture of all different frequencies of light, all different colors, and the sound level meter separates them into the individual bands, beginning with the lowest frequencies, rumble, rumble. In fact, these rumbles down here are like what you would hear from a thunderstorm on the horizon, where it's more physical. You feel it rather than hear it. In this region, you're beginning to hear it, but it still sounds like rumble. We're talking about roar, the sound of jets taking off in this frequency. And then we get into the speech frequencies, and 4,000 hertz and above are bird chirps, cymbals, the very high frequency sounds. Now, for a wind turbine, we have several different types of sounds we have to be concerned with. We have those sounds that are audible, that are processed through the cochlea. We have the reasonably steady sound of blades moving through the air. This is the aerodynamic noise when the wind coming into the wind turbines is very well behaved. When the wind coming into the blades is not well behaved, meaning there's updrafts or eddies or gusts, we get swishes and thumps. We also can have periodic, this is the amplitude modulation or blade swish that people report. We also have periodic mechanical sounds as the nacelle turns into the wind. You can hear some gearing. But the net result of that is typically rumble inside of homes and other buildings from the lower frequencies. And the one thing we know about the audible sound is because the characteristics of wind turbine noise are so much different than other community sound sources, that at any given sound level, you'll have higher annoyance for wind turbine noise than for other common community noise sources. The non-auditory or the vestibular portion of the perception, is primarily building sensations, or body sensations and building response. Body sensations may be perceived as motion sickness, nausea, sensations on a person's skin, the feeling of chest cavity movement of the eyeballs, migraine headaches, etc. There's a wide variety of sensations depending upon the person who's receiving them and the specific characteristics of the sound. The other is building response, and this is normally where we will see, looking out a large plate glass window, you'll see the window move a little bit or knickknacks on a shelf wiggle. That's again from the low frequency sound. Looking at that on a chart of frequency, this is a study that was done in Europe by an acoustic firm called Delta. They're essentially the investigating arm of the Danish EPA for acoustics. This showed they took 41 modern wind turbines, different mixes and models. I'm pretty sure they did not include one of the Synovals, but that would fit into this pattern. And we can see that if you take all 41 of those turbines and you average the data, the upper bounds and lower bounds are the brown and pink. But there's very little difference between wind turbines. In fact, a lot of these exercises of modeling wind turbines are really just exercises using the same numbers. There's very little difference between any two different makes and models because the primary noise comes from the blades, and that is produced by the wind, which is common to all of the different wind turbines. There's probably more difference in the sounds emitted if the blades were at 50 feet than if they were at 200 feet because the wind is different. But we have infrasound up here almost at 110 decibels. And again, this is from 41 different turbines. So I'm not picking out any particular one. We have low frequency sound in the 100 dB range. And by the time we get to the speech range, which is where our dBA criteria begin to have a control, we've already dropped down 20 decibels. One can say that if you took only the energy over here in this infrasound and low frequency range from a wind turbine, you would have the majority of the acoustic energy, and yet we're trying to control it by using criteria that only look at this region. And that's what's wrong with the dBA criteria. If we take that same chart and portray the data the way the wind industry prefers to do it, which is A-weighted, you can see what happens. Here we have the real acoustic spectrum on the top, but by applying A-weighting, we make it appear as though all of this low frequency sound in this region has disappeared. And that's why dBA criteria are relatively useless in controlling wind turbine noise. The second aspect is blade swish. This upper chart shows a period of about 30 seconds or so. And the up and down pattern we see on the screen is the sound of each blade swish. Whoosh, 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 coming at what is called the blade passage frequency, which for this turbine running at 20 RPM is about 1.3 seconds. So every 1.3 seconds, we get this whoosh that rises, roughly 6-7 decibels, and this is outside. Now, the difference is if you go inside a house, let me back up one more. Yeah. The bottom here, the minimum sound is because there's other sounds outside. If you were to listen to this audio tape, you hear chirps, birds, etc. When you're inside a house, the walls block those sounds. But that low frequency sound, as we can see in this circled area, comes right through the walls and is, assuming the house is quiet at night, very clearly audible. We're 20 decibels here at 160 hertz, 20 decibels above the threshold of hearing. Even at 100 hertz, we're over 10 decibels. So inside the home, that low frequency rumble becomes more of a problem. The other thing being inside a home does is it reduces all the other competing sounds. This is a chart, again, showing several seconds. It's roughly 20 seconds or 10 seconds, taken inside the entry vestibule of a home. There's 3 turbines 1,500 feet away, and these rises and falls are, again, the blade swish. But because there's no competing sounds inside the house, we can see that they're now almost 14 decibels, from 31 decibels up to about 43 decibels, about 12 decibels. And that is what makes being inside more of a problem than outside. This repetitive swishing sound becomes a dominant aspect of the indoor noise. Now, looking at the Massachusetts DEP regulations, this is from Falmouth. It was when Falmouth Wind 1 was operating at this point, and then shut down. This is very similar to the RFP that was issued for Scituate. And again, I want to point out that we're only looking at the A-weighted aspects of the wind turbine. If this was C-weighted, we would see an entirely different thing. And if it was on-weighted, even more difference. But we can see that when the turbine was running, the average was about 38. And when it was turned off and the normal ambient sounds or community sounds were allowed to take over, we dropped down to about 28 decibels. And I wouldn't see any reason why we shouldn't expect the same thing in Scituate. If you go out at night at 2 o'clock in the morning, community activities have died down. There's no nearby highways or airports that are operating. Most communities are below 30 decibels at night. And most wind turbines run, in fact, this one at 38 is fairly quiet. At 1,500 feet or 1,200 feet, I routinely see wind turbines 46, 50 decibels. But for this particular test, we see it did not pass the MDEP criteria. Well, what does it mean to have a sound level? This chart looks at how audible noise relates to annoyance. Now, I'm not talking about annoyance as we might be if our hamburger isn't quite as rare as we want it or isn't quite as well done. I'm talking about the kind of annoyance that increases cortisol, stress hormones, leads to lack of sleep, etc. And what this chart shows is that if we take guidelines set up by the World Health Organization, by the EPA, which is part of this graph, the black dots on are the EPA graphs, work done in Britain by the Hayes McKenzie group, and work done by myself and George Camperman back in 2008, combine them all into a chart that whenever the sound level from a wind turbine begins to exceed 30 dBA, we go from no reaction to sporadic complaints. At the point where it's 40 dBA, we would expect widespread complaints. And if the sound was up into the 48 dBA range, we would expect vigorous community action and strong appeals. Now, as an acoustician, I sometimes work backwards. The fact that the Scituate wind turbine has generated strong appeals to suppress the noise, widespread complaints, and I would have to assume vigorous community action would be a way to characterize today's meeting. I would expect that the sound levels that we're experiencing are in this range, somewhere between 40 decibels and possibly as high as 50 decibels. So this chart can be used two ways. One, you can take a known sound level and estimate the impact, or you can look at the impacts, judge the community's reaction, and correspondingly get an estimate of what the sound level is. Another way of looking at it, and this is a study that was done in Europe by Asia Patterson, is if the sound level outside a home is, let's say, 44 decibels, or actually in this case it's 37 decibels, I had to the conversion to the European way of doing things requires that I change that. I can expect that at least 10% of the people will be annoyed in their homes. If the sound level outside is as high as 45 decibels, I would expect that 25 to 33% will be highly annoyed, 10 to 18, will be annoyed, and 10 to 18% highly annoyed. And again, the difference here between annoyed and highly annoyed, I sometimes explain as when you're annoyed, you go out to dinner with your neighbors and you complain. When you're highly annoyed, you go out with your neighbors and hire a lawyer. So what we can expect is when we get into this kind of range of 45 to 50, we will start seeing lawsuits and threats of lawsuits. Now, I showed this chart earlier about vestibular and auditory perception. Everything we've been talking about to this point is auditory perception. I want to just take a moment here at the end and talk about low frequency. The World Health Organization in 2000, actually began in 1995, but it was followed up through 2000, had a special warning about low frequency noise. They said that when low frequency noise is present from ventilation systems, large fans, and a wind turbine is essentially a very large fan, it can disturb rest and sleep even at low sound levels. And for noise with a large proportion of low frequency sounds, a still lower guideline than 30 dBA is recommended for sleep. We take a look at their other comments. When prominent low frequency components are present, noise measures based on A weighting are inappropriate. So the MDEP's use of the difference in A weighted levels before with operation and without operation, according to the World Health Organization, are inappropriate. What they would recommend is that a better assessment of health would be to use C weighting. And with a wind turbine, you can even say unweighted. It should be noted that when there's a large proportion of low frequency components in a noise, it increases considerably the adverse effects on health. And that is what Mr. Thompson was describing earlier. And the evidence, and again, this is back in 2000, the evidence on low frequency noise is that it is sufficiently strong to warrant immediate concern. So those in the community who say, well, we passed the Massachusetts standard, are really ignoring the real issue, and that is wind turbines produce low frequency sound. Low frequency sound has a higher risk potential than regular sounds, and wind turbines produce low frequency sound. How much? Well, let's take a look at that. Here we see a graph again of frequency. This was a 2006 study done by Dr. Vandenberg in Denmark, where he documents the sound pressure level at a home as 93 dB sound pressure level. If I was to look at that same noise source, only using dBA, I would conclude that noise source was 42 decibels. And that's a big difference between the 93 total energy and the appearance on A weighting. Using C weighting, it would appear to be 56. So the point of this slide is, whenever we use filters to block the very low frequency, we are really not measuring wind turbine noise at all. Wind turbine noise is down in this range, and it requires special measurements. Here's an example of a property line in Iowa. We all like to think that Iowa has wide open spaces, so wind turbines don't need to be near them. But this wind turbine is located 1,300 feet from the home of another farmer. The dBA readings were 50 decibels outside his home. At the same time, the C readings were 65 to 70. And the linear unweighted readings were up here in the 90s with peaks going above 100. It's this sound, these peaks that we're looking at up here on top, that are causing the vestibular organs to send signals to the brain that are then misinterpreted, resulting in the nausea, migraines, motion sickness, and many of the other vestibular related symptoms. So this is a good example, again, of why a dBA criteria is not appropriate for wind turbines. Finally, because of the slow rotation speed of the larger turbines, as we get to larger and larger turbines, beginning with the 1.5 megawatts, the rotation speed of the rotors begin to slow down. The bulk of the energy, or the concentration of the energy for any rotating machine, is at what we call the blade passage frequency. Now, for 20 RPM wind turbines, for the Sinovel, it would be right in this area. And what we've known since the early 80s, and this is work NASA did in the Air Force, in order to screen candidates for fighter pilots or for astronauts, they needed to know which people were more sensitive to motion sickness. And so they set up this test. And wind turbines happen to produce the bulk of their energy right in this range, which is called the nausogenic range, below 1 hertz. And I end on this slide. Many people have said wind turbines don't produce infrasound. This is a graph showing time, this is again measured outside 1,350 feet away from a single turbine, a 1.5 GE. These are the speech frequencies up here in black. And the reason they're black is because there's not a lot of energy in that range. The highest energy is shown by white. So we go blue is about 40 decibels, purple 50 decibels. The beginning of orange 60, orange is 70, 80 is yellow, and white is 90. Pardon that. And what we see here is the infrasound range down here is where all of the energy is found. The little spikes that we're looking at, those are the pulsations. And as each of those pulsations, as they go through the vestibular organ, trigger a nerve impulse to the brain that has the brain thinking that your head is moved or the ground is moved or that some motion has occurred, when indeed no motion has occurred. It's just stimulation from the acoustic energy. So this is what I want to end on. This is the true picture of wind turbine noise. We try to control it with dBA criteria, which look at these frequencies up here, which aren't important, while we exclude and we try to do it with long-term averaging, a 10-minute average or a 1-hour average, when indeed the problem is down here in 0 to 20 hertz with these short, high amplitude pulsations coming off of the blades. So with that, I end, and I'll bring up my smiling face again, see if we have any questions.
All right, Rick, can you still hear us? I think he inadvertently shut himself down here, so just bear with me.
Tom, can I share something with you?
Please.
In the late 1990s, I was developing HVAC products, and our single biggest problem wasn't the control of the airflow, it was the noise that was produced.
Mm-hmm.
And the things that he brought up today reminded me of how complicated it was to try to get people to understand it. The DBA that he talked about, we passed with flying colors. It was a low-frequency sounds, exactly what he said, in the airflow products we were developing that caused us problems. And the whole industry was trying to use DBA for the readings, and we found out we couldn't do it because people complained about the products.
Right.
So we had to make changes to things dramatically, all because of the way you had to, the DBA versus the low-frequency sounds and what you had to do to filter and understand what those were doing. So he hits home very, not so fondly, but what I remember very well in trying to develop the products. And I'm just curious, what question I'm going to ask him, if he has any sort of sound primer that makes that easy to understand for most of us that aren't anywhere near where he is on understanding the levels.
So logistically, if we have an issue here with getting him back, we'll provide Rick's email address, and we can either facilitate it through us or you can ask the questions directly. So, okay? And it's a shame we've lost him here. All right, Rick, well, wherever you are, thank you very much. All right, so we've just had our session on Acoustics 101, and we now want to move to the topic of shadow flicker. What you are seeing here right now is a link to a 42-minute video that was shot by a family here in the community that lives within about 650 feet of this industrial wind turbine. And on a sunny day, anywhere from 1 to 3 hours per day, what you are seeing is what they experience. They are forced to leave their homes. We are actually hoping to have this shot for a better part of an hour anyway, and they had to shut it down after 42 minutes because of the impacts that their family were experiencing. This is a family that has 2 young children. Their grades have suffered. There's been documented evidence provided to the Board of Health on this particular file, which has up until now been ignored. A couple of other things that I wanted to just touch on this. This family was one of the few families that actually received notice of the potential commissioning of this industrial wind turbine back in the permitting process. And they were forced to stand alone without any support from the community because this was not an issue that was known to a lot of people within the town. They actually took the initiative to walk door to door in and around Third Cliff to make people aware of this during the permitting process. And unfortunately, most of us turned our backs on this family at that point in time, in fairness, not understanding the issue. So they were forced to go it alone, and they were forced to bring forward an action against the town once the turbine was operational and they started to experience the noise and the shadow flicker such as you are seeing here today. They brought an action forward against the town, and all they were asking for was relief. Unfortunately, an attorney for the town insurance company decided that he would try to portray these people as uncredible. Unclean was the word that was actually disappointingly used during this particular legal proceeding. I can assure you that the people that live in that house are folks that are of the highest credibility and integrity, and all they do is do what any of us would do, and that is to stand up and defend their property owner rights and protect the health and safety of their children. I've come to know this family over the last few months. I am proud and honored to call them colleagues and friends. And at this point in time, I would like to introduce the gentleman who's the patriarch of this family so he can himself explain in detail the real-life experiences that they are focused and impacted by as a result of this shadow flicker. Ladies and gentlemen, my friend, Mr. Mark McKeever.
My name is Mark McKeever. I live 640 feet from the wind turbine. I would like to take a moment before I speak about the flicker to give you a little background information. My grandmother has owned this property on the Driftway since 1954. Both of my parents grew up in Scituate. My mother actually spent part of her childhood playing in the same yard as my children do today. Excuse me. My dad was a teacher and a coach in Scituate for 20 years until his sudden passing. I loved everything about Scituate. Many of my childhood memories were spent out on the spit and at Young's Boatyard with my grandparents. I've lived on the Driftway for the past 16 years. My wife has for 14. In 2006, we purchased a piece of land from my grandmother. In 2008, we moved into our home at 151 Driftway with 2 young children. My wife and I believed the town of Scituate would be a great place for our children to grow up. I have to say, I don't believe that anymore. In 2010, we were the only ones opposed to the turbine. We were alone. The industrial turbine was going to be constructed even after I expressed my concerns on numerous occasions to town officials. Representatives of Scituate Wind, including Sumul Shah, their engineer and attorneys, met with us at our home. Sumul told us that this turbine would not make myself or my children sick, and we wanted to believe him. The agreement that was made was only about the permitting of this wind turbine before it was constructed. This agreement is not relevant to the petition of the Board of Health that the industrial turbine should be shut down. Our case before the Board of Health is not about the permitting. The case is about my family. My family. The fact is that since the industrial wind turbine started operating last year, we have been continually sick and our children are sick. We had no idea how massive this wind turbine would be next to our home. The day the turbine blades rolled into town is the day we learned it was bigger than we ever could have imagined. While others celebrated its arrival, we were worried. But hopefully everything would be okay. We soon realized after it became operational, it wasn't. The lawsuit was an appeal of the Board of Health's decision not to shut down the wind turbine. We brought the suit in December 2012 because we felt the Board of Health wasn't acting fast enough to protect our children. We respect the court's decision that the appeal of the Board of Health's decision was premature and are following the court's guidance to wait for the Board of Health's review all of the evidence and make a final determination as to whether the industrial wind turbine should be shut down. With that being said, let's talk about the flicker. Where do I begin? I guess I could say it speaks for itself, however it doesn't. What you are seeing on this video here is nothing, and I repeat, nothing like experiencing it firsthand. It's overwhelming. We have experienced headaches and dizziness, as my daughter would say on numerous occasions. Daddy, it hurts. The flicker starts in our front yard, then it moves into our home. Within minutes, it has engulfed our entire property. You can see the blade's rotation in our yard, furthest away from the turbine, and we have nowhere to go. We cannot have guests at this time. Our children cannot play outside. We cannot enjoy our home. We have to leave because this strobe light flicker gives us headaches when we do stay. It is in every single room in my home. I was recently asked, why don't we use blinds to reduce the flicker? My response, why should I have to do that? We live in a beautiful community in Scituate, Massachusetts. Why? Even if we tried, the strobe light flicker takes control over our entire home and yard, and it is impossible to get away from it no matter what we do. From October through March, we have experienced about 85 hours of flicker on our property and home. The actual hours are much higher, however. We were not home to document on some of those sunny days. I believe the estimated time of expected flicker was stated to be approximately 30 hours a year. We have certainly exceeded that number. We are not the only ones to endure shadow flicker from this turbine. As the seasons change, more members of our community are and will be affected. Some of you may have experienced the flicker crossing the road on the driftway during the morning hours. Now try to imagine it in your bedroom, your living room, kitchen, bathroom, and hallways. Now imagine it in all of those rooms at one time. We have sent numerous videos to the Board of Health so they could understand the severity of the flicker. No one from the Board of Health or any other town official has come to our home to experience it for themselves. Nobody has come. Watching the flicker on a video is one way to experience it, but seeing it in person is awful. I believe it would make anyone feel glad that they do not live there. We do not wish this upon anyone. Our main concern, and always has been, is the health of our children. We have headaches, we have ringing in our ears, we do not sleep. Let me rephrase that. We have headaches, we have ringing in our ears, and we do not sleep. We're very concerned about how our children's continued exposure to adverse effects of the industrial turbine will affect their physical cognitive growth and development. They should not have to go to school tired. They should not have to be dismissed from school because they have headaches. They should not have to wait to do their homework until the flicker stopped in their home. Everyone deserves to be in a safe environment to live in. My children deserve it. As a community, are unfortunate to be experiencing the effects of this industrial wind turbine. My family is not alone anymore, and we stand together as a community to protect our families from the harm that has been brought upon us. My family would like to thank the community group for their understanding and support, and many thanks to Mr. Thompson, Mr. Kelly, and Michelle Banning for their friendship, support, and dedication. Thank you.
Does anybody have a question for either Mr. McKeever or I on this particular topic before we move on to our next speaker? Sir.
Quickly, Paul McSorley, you live on the Driftway. We are new to Scituate. Been there 3 years. You enjoyed it as well, and we were a bit surprised too at the implementation of this huge turbine. And I feel bad for Mr. McKeever being alone during this process when it was being implemented. But how did other neighboring towns like Duxbury and Cohasset fight this and prevent it from happening? And the town is so enthusiastic about the success of it and the $250,000 they received each year. Excuse me. Are there any other plans for any other? They're going to be doing this more in Scituate? There are plans for other parts of town that are going to sneak under the radar?
So I think I can fairly safely say that the town at least knows that we're watching what's happening on anything that has anything to do with alternative energy in this town. Unfortunately, that level of attention wasn't being paid when this process was underway. I'll answer the town of Scituate component to this, Mr. McSorley, and perhaps I might invite Joanne Levesque, if she feels comfortable doing so, maybe to get briefly discussing the Duxbury situation, if that's in everybody's comfort zone. But so one of the reasons that I brought up the Green Communities Act and the accelerated permitting process and the reduced level of approval barriers that you have to meet, it sort of goes in tandem with the other unfortunate development that took place during the fiscal cliff negotiation, and that was the extension of the production tax credit for another 12 months. So generally speaking, for those that don't know, there's an animal called the production tax credit, and essentially what that is that's a tax credit scheme that wind developers can utilize to help finance and advance these alternative energy projects. So that was due to expire at the end of 2012. It's now been extended for a year. So for communities that aren't paying attention, there is the possibility that there could be utilizing something like the Green Communities Act here in the Commonwealth, where there could be an acceleration of a permitting process for another location for one of these turbines. And as we saw in the last example, this was done fairly quietly leading up to this one. And I think the important point that I want to make here is that that second potential wind turbine, if it is in fact on the docket, is probably not going here. So it could be going someplace else in Scituate. So I think it's important for people that don't live on Third Cliff or the surrounding area that although you may not think that this directly impacts you, it may directly impact you. And from our perspective, if it directly impacts people over on Egypt Beach or Minot or whatever, that impacts us because we're residents and members of this community, and if there's some other location that's being considered away from here, we will make doggone sure that we support that community group in defending themselves from this example. So I'm not aware of anything that's in play, but I do know with those couple of variables that there is the potential for that. Now, Duxbury and other communities, you know, they've been impacted much longer than we have in some instances. These turbines have been operational and so on, but we've actually been able to rely on those experiences to help us, wage this battle, if you will. And the input that we've received from our dear friend Joanne Levesque and others has been very, very valuable in that respect. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Larry Howell, Moreland Road. Was this not studied at the time of the permitting and brought before town meeting for vote? I'm not sure of the history, but there is a history, I think, behind this. It wasn't just sprung all of a sudden.
Yeah, I'm not aware of there being a town vote. Now, that may have preceded my time here because I moved here in 2007. What I do know is that there was the modeling that, such as Mr. McKeever has relayed, the modeling that was utilized for this completely understated both the acoustical impacts and the level of shadow flicker that was supposed to be emanating from this industrial wind turbine. So the data in the permitting process in no way, shape, or form actually reflects what's happening with that industrial wind turbine today. We do know that there was limited distribution and information for members of the community. I think the town was required to post a notice in a newspaper, which wasn't the Mariner and it wasn't the Boston Globe, so it may not have been as well read by volume as it otherwise should have been. And then, of course, utilizing the Green Communities Act, such as we understand it from a layman's perspective, there's these accelerated permitting processes and the ability to achieve perhaps reduced levels of diligence along the way. So that's the layman's answer. Sir.
Steve Tassini, Vernon Road. I live nowhere near this thing, all right? And that's very powerful. So if it's a lot worse than that, oh my goodness. I'm curious, you said that you were given notice of this, as I take it as in a abutter. Because I don't know how you were alone. You stood alone, before any of us knew what this thing was going to be. All right, so you stood alone. There aren't very many houses over there. You're affected by this, clearly. You said other people are affected by this as well. Where else? What other homes are affected, and where are those people?
Well, I live 3,000.
Okay, so you're seeing. I'm serious now. I don't live anywhere near this. You're seeing this same thing, and they don't. Let me tell you what those of us who don't live near here think it is. We think it's a red light flashing that you're talking about.
No.
That's what we think it is.
No.
Wow, that's powerful.
And not only is it powerful, but it's, we're very, very simple people, okay? And to deal with this from October until like March, and I think some people think that we're trying to build this up to be something bigger than it already is. When I say, you can stand maybe 15 or 20 minutes in this, you literally, you have to leave. And, whether it's in the, December or January and it's, potentially up to 3 hours, why do, my question to some of the selectmen, why do I have to leave my house? Why?
So as the sun moves in the sky, then
yes,
after March.
Correct. As the sun, when we turned the clocks back 2 weeks ago, we're still getting a little bit of flicker in the backyard, but
It disappears over the summertime, more or less?
yes, because of I believe the height of the sun, that just the angle of it won't hit the blades as
I've
much.
experienced maybe a couple times, a minute or two of flicker.
And
Noise, we can discuss that a little bit, but
it's
I think
just very
high,
it's
a jet way off.
it's
someplace
extremely uncomfortable.
that I hear. And I'm right
We
down
live
the
in
street.
James Landing, far away, and we've had that flicker in our bedroom and in our bathroom in our living room for at least 20 minutes, half hour.
Okay, in the interest of time, can I take one last question, and then after the event, we'll all be hanging around afterwards, and we'd be more than happy to answer. So,
Have the elected officials of this town failed us? And if they have, they need to be held accountable. Here, people weren't aware, this was snuck in, sweetheart deal, you name it. And somebody has to answer for it.
So we'll have an opportunity actually to discuss that topic a little bit later in the program. But yes, one last question, sir, please.
Yeah, hi. John Cranston. I live on Hawley Road, nowhere near. I just want to be clear. You guys, no one knew that there was going to be any flicker from this? Nobody told you guys that there was going to be flicker from a windmill?
I had brought up, prior to the permitting process, the town had a renewable energy committee, and they consisted of a few individuals from town. And you know, that was one of my biggest concerns, was obviously the noise and the flicker, and the other thing was the ice throws. And you know, I was promised, you know, you're not going to get flicker. If you do get it, it's just going to be a very short period of time. And unfortunately, I'm a young guy. I believed the people that were telling me that we weren't going to have a lot of flicker. And then now, again, my wife videotapes a lot of these and send them to the Board of Health, and we've gotten no response.
All right, so on that, we should move to the next segment. But Mark, thank you very much for having the courage to stand up here and tell your story. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your patience. Moving on, so we talked a little bit about during our opening remarks that we wanted to take a three-pronged approach to this particular matter with the Board of Health in the town, which they refused. And that the three key ingredients were obviously the acoustical impacts emanating from the industrial wind turbine, and Rick has done a great job addressing that, and you'll have a chance to ask questions of him when we finish up here. The second issue, of course, is we wanted to discuss and get an analysis of the actual shadow flicker emanating from that industrial wind turbine, and notwithstanding the fact that we didn't get agreement from the Board of Health to do that, I think that we've been able to reasonably portray exactly what folks are experiencing there. So the third component to this, and again, when we approached the Board of Health, we wanted to discuss with them the health and safety impacts resulting from the turbine from an acoustical and shadow flicker perspective. And we wanted to have some analysis on that. So we thought it was appropriate that we would introduce an individual who was a specialist in this particular area and allow him to discuss a little bit further the issues around sleep and sleep deprivation, etc. So it is my honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Jeffry Silver. Dr. Silver is a sleep medicine specialist at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center and board certified by the American Board of Internal Medicine, specializing in sleep medicine. Born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Dr. Silver studied neuropsychology at the University of Lausanne,
Switzerland.
Pronouncing that right, in Switzerland, and has earned a Bachelor of Science degree from Lehigh University. Dr. Silver is also a medical school graduate of Boston University. Dr. Silver's postdoctoral training in neurology and sleep and behavioral neuroscience was also conducted at Boston University. Dr. Silver has enjoyed numerous honors and awards during his career and has earned board certification from the American Board of Internal Medicine, diplomat of the American Board of Sleep Medicine, and the American Board of Internal Medicine with a subspecialty certification in sleep medicine. His credentials are without challenge, and we are delighted to have Dr. Silver here with us today. Please introduce him.
Thank you. Thank you. Can everybody hear me? I'm not one that likes to talk with mics. If you can't hear me, I will talk louder. Just let me know. In the back there, Jerry, you can hear me? I won't let you fall asleep, I promise. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to all of you today on sleep deprivation and what can cause sleep deprivation. We all kind of realize that 1/3 of our life is spent sleeping. We don't think about it, but 1/3 of what you do in the duration of your life is sleep. So we might as well do it well. We might as well get the full benefit of sleep. People who do not sleep well do have major medical issues, work issues, health issues, and it has been well known by the National Sleep Foundation, by the Motor Vehicle Associations, that sleep deprivation is one of the major causes of motor vehicle accidents in the United States. So not getting a good night's sleep affects us across the board, at all ages, from our ability to learn, to our ability to perform, and even our mood. You've all probably had a night where you've not slept well and woke up the next day tired, groggy, a little bit more confused, irritable. Well, those are all common side effects of either short-term or long-term sleep deprivation. It's a very common problem in today's society due to the world we live in and the high technology, and everybody is now on a 24-hour cycle. We're trying to find that 25th hour to just sleep. And as you can see, the things that are often common as you start to get into both short-term and long-term sleep deprivation is people do develop mood changes. Children will become more impulsive. Adults become more irritable. So don't always yell at your kids if they're not sleeping well. Excessive sleepiness during the day makes it more difficult to function both at work, school. Cognitively, we become less alert. Our attention span diminishes. We develop what they call executive dysfunction. Some of you may notice as we all mature, I don't like the word age, but as we all mature, our ability to multitask diminishes. Our ability to kind of do things that we used to take like that is not as good as it used to be. Well, with sleep deprivation, that becomes even more pronounced. And that's why we're always trying to say in our memories going, what was that name we wanted? Where was it that we were trying to forget? Well, sleep deprivation and sleep problems can lead to those kinds of very simple task-finding phenomena that we all deal with. We're at work, there's more likelihood of mental and physical errors. So if you work, whether you work at a paper job or you work as a mechanic, you have a higher risk of making a mistake as a mechanic, or in the shift work world, you have a higher risk of not just errors on the job, but the danger of errors if you're working with machines, getting your hand cut off, getting impaired in one way or another. Next slide. So why is it so important that we get a good night's sleep? Well, besides the obvious that we're not going to function as well, poor sleep in numerous studies has been shown to affect us in many medical issues. It's a cause of cardiovascular risk. People who do not sleep enough over time have a higher risk of coronary disease, heart attacks. With that, the risk of blood pressure and elevation of blood pressure is worse. Obesity. One of the problems when we don't sleep well is that we are at a higher risk of gaining weight. And with gaining weight in today's American society, you always hear everybody talking about weight. It's probably the number one cause of the growing medical problem, diabetes, in this country. And with diabetes, the risk of heart, blood pressure actually increases anywhere from 4 to 10-fold. So that not just are we not able to think, behave as well, we don't sleep well, we put ourselves at medical risk. We put ourselves at a higher risk of gaining weight, heart disease. Next. Diabetes, I've already mentioned. There's numerous studies showing that sleep deprivation and inadequate sleep is increasing our risk for insulin resistance, making it more difficult for us to handle and metabolize sugar, developing more complications of diabetes. Physiologically, poor sleep does alter our immune system. People over time are at a higher risk for colds, flus, infection. They're not able to fight off as well. The worse the sleep deprivation becomes, the longer you have problems sleeping, the more the immune system is affected. Next. Cognition, as I said, your ability to be accurate at the job, your ability to learn, recall, perform, stay alert, all diminishes. And it gets worse with time. So when we talk in the medical world of a sleep problem, we always define it as an acute problem, which is of maybe several days, to an intermediate problem, which is of several weeks, to chronicity or chronic sleep deprivation, which is of greater than 3 weeks. And if you look through the literature, the dates and the times may vary a little bit, but short-term problems that become long-term problems only magnify these issues. The good news is that if we do develop a way to deal with a short sleep, we deal with the deprivation, you can reverse a lot of these problems. So the good news for all of you, it's not irreversible once you develop a problem when it comes to sleep deprivation. But if you do nothing about it, you do put yourself at high risk. The risk of safety, driving, falling asleep at the wheel, being impaired because you get into these little microfit states when you're sleep deprived, your body at all costs will try to maintain its sleep. You've all have experienced times when you just sit down, next thing you know, the movie's over. Don't remember what it was, but it must have been a good one. You also at times, at the same time, felt so tired that you sat down and you couldn't sleep. But we're kind of this fog and really weren't really following. Students who read the same page for 45 times and still can't figure out what 2 + 2 is. Because when you start to get into sleep deprivation issues, your impairment to retain, to learn, to recall is affected greatly. It was kind of interesting when I was seeing the Strobe, just on a side note. One of the things that I do as a physician is when I'm looking for seizure disorders is we do what we call photic stimulation. Photic stimulation is to actually strobe a light in front of that individual that we're monitoring with EEGs to determine whether we can induce migraines, induce stroke, when you're trying to make the diagnosis of seizures. So it's kind of interesting that unfortunately you have to live in a very photic world. Next. So what is adequate sleep, and how we start to talk about what it is that you may all end up being affected with by not getting enough sleep. Well, if you look at the literature, initially what was considered to be defined as a adequate period of sleep is between about 6 to 8 hours. In the last 3 to 4 years now, some newer literature is coming out saying that it's probably closer to maybe 7 to 8 hours. And that less than 6 hours is usually for 90% of this world inadequate. Yes, there are some people, God bless them, who only need 4 hours of sleep, but most of us need between 6 to 8, and most of us actually need 7 to 8 to really be restored functionally. In the same breath of note, too much sleep, over 8 hours, can make you more tired. But I always like to liken it to you've all, at one time or another, like instead of coming here to listen to me talk, slept in on a Sunday just to relax, not work. And if you notice, if you just kind of stay in bed and lounge around, you actually become more fatigued, more tired. You don't really get started as quickly. So too much sleep, too little sleep have the same effects. Sleep disruption and sleep deprivation, which is too little sleep or inadequate sleep, is what I'm really talking to you about today, because it is a growing problem in this country because of the work hours that we all put in, because of the time restraints that are put on us from our family, our kids, our children, you name it. And then to have another added environmental bonus disrupting your sleep and shorten that period just becomes more and more problematic. And in doing so, we all end up becoming less efficient, not more efficient. We end up becoming less productive, not more productive. Sleep, though we all take it for granted, is probably one of the most important things that each and every one of you do every night. It's during sleep that we restore our bodies in slow wave sleep. Some people believe it's during dream sleep that our memories and our thought processes are imprinted for memory and learning. And if we don't get that, we don't function as well. We don't learn as quickly. We're not as apt to be as good as we could, not all that we could be. So what are the causes of sleep? Well, I'd be remiss not to tell you that there are a lot of medical issues when I see patients in my sleep lab for sleep disorders. Primary sleep disorders such as insomnia. Insomnia can come from anxiety about worrying about your children. You're not going to sleep well. Anybody that's ever had children that have been sick, we all know that we give up our sleep for them. Other primary medical issues besides insomnia are restless legs, sleep disordered breathing. Medical issues disrupt your sleep. Asthma, things that we just take for granted. Thyroid dysfunction, diabetes, getting up with sugar problems. Pain, arthritis. We've all had, I know we're around a golf course. If you're all playing golf at the end of the day, you throw your back out, you're not going to sleep as well. These are the ones that, as a physician, I see all the time. I treat neurologic disorders, psychiatric disorders, but the one that I want to focus a little bit more on are the environmental disruptors of sleep. Some of them we can deal with, some of them we can't. If you have a baby that's keeping you up at night, that's going to take about 20 years to get rid of that. If you know a quicker way, let me know. My last one's 18, so I'm hoping it's soon. Temperature, the temperature of the room that we sleep in can disrupt your sleep. But believe it or not, you're better served to sleep in a cold environment than a warm environment. You sleep better in cold rooms. Noise, besides the waking baby, any noise that disrupts your sleep, any noise that will fragment your sleep impairs your ability to get that nice, continuous quality sleep that we all look for, that we all need to be all we can be, to function the next day. And how you perform today is reflected dramatically and directly by how you slept the night before. So if you all had a bad night's sleep today, you're probably about ready to doze off, because this is about 3, 4, it's a mid-afternoon dip, the time when you will be tired. So I'll try to keep you awake talking loud. Not too loud, because I know noise is bad for you. But that being said, it is important to understand that these environmental factors are real. We live with them. Some of them we can control. Some of them we need to alter. But they do affect sleep. And in fact, if you look at the coding for sleep disorders, you'll actually see that there's a code when I see people who come to my clinic for environmental sleep disorders. And the definition of environmental sleep disorder is one that impairs the ability to have a quality or sufficient or adequate sleep that cannot be defined by a medical cause, medication, other psychiatric issues, but is associated and correlates directly with a well-known disruptor, such as noise, light, temperature. It is treatable, as I said to you. Sleep deprivation, if you're allowed to treat the problem, get rid of the noise, deal with the problem, treat the arthritis pain, you can restore your sleep. And by restoring your sleep, all the issues in terms of cognitive, in terms of the increased risk for gaining weight, cardiac, blood pressure, diabetes, all can be reversed according to that factor. Now understand, there are other factors that play into developing diabetes, heart disease. That's why your doctors look at your cholesterol, treat your blood pressure, try to get you to exercise, all the right things, so to speak. But in this world, when we're trying to fight all those issues, adding a new environmental factor that can be reversed, that can cause trouble, we all need to think about, is it worth it? What are the risk benefits? Or what are we gaining? And what are we losing? Losing a bad night's sleep is far worse for not just you, but for your children, for your work. Poor performance, you may lose your job. It is important to understand that we live in a world where we are pulled in so many different directions. We live in a world where we're all trying to deal and manage 100 things in that 28-hour day that we only have 23 hours to play. And we need to think about how we're going to risk-benefit and risk-stratify how we're going to deal with our issues. Sleep deprivation has been well studied. There are numerous studies, both by the National Sleep Foundation, motor vehicle divisions have looked at it numerous times. What I can tell you, because I actually, when Jerry asked me to give this talk, is I went through all the archives I could find. There's been no study in terms of the full effects on the turbine and sleep, but there are numerous studies on noise and sleep, sleep disruption, sleep deprivation, that you can easily correlate to what's going on here. I think it's important that you as a community, I don't live in this community, but I think it's important that you as a community understand that, yeah, we all need to go green. We all need our energy sources. We all need to do what's right, but we need to do what's right at the right cost. We need to do what's right and not affecting our health, or our kids' health, or our future of your community, but in a way we can all live happily. You know, and it's time, I think, that people start to understand that, you know, there are factors that we can't deal with. I can't change your genetic predisposition for heart disease, diabetes, but we can improve your sleep by knocking out the factors that we can deal with. We can help provide each and every one of you a better night's sleep with a better day's function. It's easy for me to talk to you about this. I don't live here, so I walk away. At the end of the day, I go back to my home. But you know, this is something that could happen in my neighborhood just as easily as it did in yours. This is why I'm here talking to you today, because I do believe that we need to be intelligent about our energy sources. We need to be intelligent about what we're doing, because we do need to find green ways to deal with this. But we also need to kind of balance and make sure everybody understands the risk benefits. I've always believed that the right decision is one that we all can live with. We may not all like, but one that we can all live with. Getting a good night's sleep is the first start. I'd like to take questions. I can talk all day on sleep or anything I want, but I'd like to take some questions to help you guys understand better about what I'm talking about. Are there any questions? Oh, was that thorough? Yes.
On that strobe aspect that you were mentioning, because where I live, I do get early morning flicker.
Uh-huh.
And I've noticed that I wake up and I suddenly think, something's wrong with my brain. You know, I mean, it actually affects, you know, and I have the curtain drawn and everything, but the sun is so strong that the flicker is causing this.
Light and photic light is a cause of many disruptions. I mean, light, actually, one of the things that I do with bright light is I use it to train people's sleep cycles for phase shift workers and stuff. But the time of when light hits you will affect when you fall asleep and when you stay awake and when you don't. Photic changes, if it's rhythmic or not rhythmic, can cause your eyes to try to sync with that. And when you try to sync with it, if you're not there, it can actually cause more strain because you're trying to really focus hard, which can sometimes be a form of tension. It's one of the reasons why it can induce migraines in some people. It's one of the reasons why, because of the photic stimulation, the brain's trying to sync with it, that you can actually induce seizures. It's one of the reasons why in a EEG study, electroencephalographic study for seizures, you do photic stimulation to try to see whether you can induce it. You also do sleep deprivation because poor sleep, and in fact, 1/3 of all seizures occur at night. People are unaware of it. So that there are many facts that can disrupt sleep, and the photic changes can also cause problems with your eyes trying to sync in terms of equilibrium.
Could it actually, I mean, I probably don't experience it long enough, but could it actually cause a seizure?
It induces, the cause is probably not the appropriate terminology. It can induce by changing the threshold. You'd be better served to ask an epileptologist, a seizure expert on that, but I do know it changes the threshold, which can improve the likelihood of a seizure developing.
So with small children involved, as Mr. McKeever has, presumably the brain is developing, and they're experiencing it much, much longer periods.
And they are probably having more trouble acclimating. I mean, the only thing that's interesting, if you look in studies of sleep deprivation, the younger people are more susceptible to the effects of sleep deprivation than older people, interestingly enough. There are a lot of questions as to why. Some of it has to do with attenuation of our functions as we age. And younger, more plastic children are more sensitive to these kind of interventions and these kind of disruptors. But studies have clearly shown that younger people are more susceptible to the irritability, the mood, and the problems that occur with sleep deprivation than adults. Both will get it if you do it long enough. But in acute terms, younger people will be affected first and usually more dramatically. Any other questions? Yes?
Are you willing to start a new study regarding the effects with the turbines? Where you said there are no other physicians and no one else in the area that's doing this?
There's no studies I could find in the archives of the country. Do I want to start in my spare time? I have 3 kids in college.
I received an email from a community in Wisconsin that have a similar issue to us, and I was going to ask Dr. Silver that question when we finished up today. So
there are people that can direct you to who could handle that study. My practice, I'd be very honest with you, my practice and what I do right now would limit my ability to do that study right. But there are people I can give you names who would be more than happy to probably help you. Are there any other questions? I thank you for the opportunity to talk to you all today. Thank you.
thank you very much. Appreciate it. Rick James, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right. Before we move on to the next program, now that we have Rick and our technology's working and out of fear of something happening, do we have some questions of Rick back on Acoustics 101? Yes.
What would the indoors of decibel possibly be, and the distance affected by the turbine, and what might the effect be on sleep and duration?
So given the length of the question, why don't I invite you to come up and you can talk in the microphone, and then Rick will probably be able to answer that. Thank you. You can hear me fine from the microphone, Rick?
I wasn't able to hear the question.
No, we've got a young lady who's coming to the podium and she's going to ask you directly. Excuse me one second.
Rick is Skype.
Hi. This is my question. Okay, what would the decibel level be and the length of the wavelength that one might experience indoors in a house, and the distance from the turbine, and might it affect sleep, and for what duration would the wavelength have to be being experienced?
Okay. Well, let me give, I heard some discussion a little bit earlier about the Wisconsin study. You need to make a change there, Tom?
No, I'm just turning up the volume so people can hear you. Rick, go ahead, please.
Okay. I heard a discussion or a question earlier about the Wisconsin study, and I was involved in that. I can use that as an example. One of the houses was 3,000 feet away from the nearest turbine. We found infrasound below 1 hertz. That would be almost 1,000-foot wavelength. Those waves were so large that we had microphones on the second floor, the first floor, and the basement of the homes. And there wasn't any observable difference between the sounds we received at any of those 3 floors. Literally, the infrasound entered the home as though the home was just a small object, penetrated the entire home equally, and the issue of how long that would have to be there, the people that were living in that, it took, after the wind turbine started, he said it took him about 6 weeks before he could relate the new sensations to the wind turbines. He thought he was having a problem independent of the wind turbines. There was no preconceived notion about infrasound or other types of disturbances. And about 6 weeks into the new wind turbine operation, he began to notice that he had the feelings of motion sickness only at the times the turbines were running. So, and at this point, he and his family have vacated the home, as have 3 other people in that community. So the wavelengths of the important aspect of the acoustic energy down below 1 hertz are so large that your home is swamped as though it was a tsunami. These pulsations go on for whatever period the wind turbines are operating. We actually had one test at a home 1.25 miles away from the nearest wind turbine when the turbine blades were barely turning. And you could still see clearly that as each pulse came to the house, it again saturated the whole home from top floor down to basement. We're talking about, we'll call it energy that is not normally produced by any man-made devices other than possibly explosives. It's in the range where tornadoes, earthquakes create the rumbles and the energy that can cause structural damage if it's high enough. This isn't high enough to cause the damage, but it does cause the sensations. So it's actually a field where we know very little about. And that's one of the problems that's been facing us is we want to make this wind turbine noise issue like all other community noise issues. And it's not. This is an entirely new type of experience for people. We don't know what the exposure dose ratios are. All we can say is that when people are exposed to these sounds on an ongoing basis, a certain percentage of them will have certain symptoms, and those symptoms will be related to vestibular disturbance. we really need to get the government's attention and proper funding. And that's what many of the acousticians and medical doctors have been asking for. I noticed there was also a talk on sleep disturbance, but I wasn't able to pick up all of it. Dr. Nissenbaum from Maine does have a peer-reviewed paper in which he studied sleep disturbance for people on Vinyl Haven Island and also on Mars Hill out to distances of about 2 kilometers, and was able to correlate the sleep disturbance with distance to the turbines with a very high degree of correlation. His statement is that anything less than 4,500 feet is clearly unacceptable as a separation distance.
Thank you. I just wanted to add that perhaps because we do live on the ocean, and this is where I was born and raised, some people might have discounted it and said that it's just like when there's a storm coming and the surf is up and you do feel the pounding and all of that. But that's not every day, all year. Yeah.
That is a very important distinction. It's what duration, but there's another distinction, and that is the wind turbine infrasound has pulses that are not characteristic of ocean waves or other natural infrasound noise sources. And so not only is there a difference in the duration of exposure, there's also a difference in the actual way the pressure interacts with our perceptive organs.
Okay, Rick, thank you. Please stay with us. In the interest of time, we're going to move to the last topic of the day.
Okay.
But please stay with us because there may be some other questions that folks have of you offline. So thank you very much. And thank you, Dr. Silver. Our next agenda item, and we're actually only about 10 minutes behind schedule, so we're not doing too badly, is a gentleman who has resided here in the community since the early 70s. I think he's well known to all of you. He is somebody that I'm proud to have worked on this file with, to sat on our community steering committee with, and worked closely on this topic, and we've become good friends as a result of it. And he has some information that he would like to bring forward specific to the upcoming spring town meeting. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to Mr. Jerry Kelly.
First off, thank you all for coming today. You had better things to do with your time, but we appreciate your participation in this. Jeff needed to leave, but I'd like to thank him for keeping us all awake during his presentation also. I want to talk to you briefly about town meeting. The McKeevers, as everybody mentioned, sought their ills to be addressed by the court. And the court informed us to follow due process. And the due process was to start with the Board of Health, to go to the selectmen, to go to town meeting, and although we've been advised by town council that it will be non-binding, it will be a referendum that will be a voting referendum. So it's part of the continuum that we must address. Town meeting occurs next month. There is a warrant on the town meeting to rescind the special permit for the industrial wind turbine. The reasons for it are what you heard today: shadow flicker and noise. We started with the Board of Health, and the Board of Health member that was assigned to our committee accused us of having invented the science for acoustic noise measurement. And what you heard today was you heard Rick James speak about it. We didn't invent anything. And as a matter of fact, the DEP has stated that the current measurement of sound is antiquated and must be updated. So the Board of Health has stated to us that they will not support our action. The selectmen has stated to us unanimously that they will not support our action. Other towns have taken a far different approach to it. Falmouth, the selectmen are voting to discontinue the operation of some of their industrial wind turbines. Quincy or Milton, I think it was Quincy, at the Granite Links Golf Course has pulled the permit for the industrial wind turbine to be operated during the summertime. As we proceed, and as we have proceeded, there have been material errors and misstatements for all of the studies that were done related to this, many of the studies that were done related to this industrial wind turbine. Shadow flicker, noise, and others. We also have an issue of the operator of Scituate Wind is a limited liability corporation that's owned by another limited liability corporation that ultimately is owned by a construction company. The other side of that is an investment bank, small investment banker that finances these things. The construction company has not formally filed for bankruptcy, but its assets have been auctioned. So, you know, they really don't have the ability to be the operator as we go forward. So as a result of it, during the big blizzard this year, one of the requirements is that they have an aeronautical beacon on it by the FAA. Those of you who looked at it, for 3 days, that aeronautical beacon was not blinking. So there was not a backup generator that caused that to be operating. It was dark. My message is simple to everybody. We've got town meeting that's coming up. It dates back to Puritan times. It's the way we govern ourselves. It's the way we make rules for the town. It isn't just the approval of public works and school budgets. And this is important. We need to have the people that feel strongly about this, one way or the other, to participate in town meetings so we can continue the process. Once again, I'd like to thank everybody who was here today, who gave up some of your Saturday. And those of you who had Michigan and Michigan State in bracketology, put a big smile on your face.
Thank you, Jerry. So ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. You've heard the story, you've heard the history, you've heard the conversation around the 3 key areas that we feel are important, why they should have been embraced by the Board of Health and they weren't. You've heard experts describe to you in layman's terms the nuances and the issues in their individual fields of endeavor. We hope that you've had an opportunity to learn a bit about this particular topic. We hope that you'll come out to town meeting and support the petition to rescind the special permit so we can eliminate the operation of this industrial wind turbine. Any information that you need on that, feel free to speak to Jerry or I. We need your friends, we need your neighbors, and we need your loved ones to come out and support us at town meeting on April the 9th. And we look forward to your support in that respect. Before we wrap it up, I see we do have one question, so please.
I wish we would stop referring to this as a flicker. It sounds like a romantic candle, and it is not. It's a strobe light, and you cannot get away from it. Thank you.
Thank you. Sir.
What do we say as far as the study that you're negotiating with the Board of Health or whomever as far as having all the elements covered that you want to have covered? What does it stand for?
So we, as you know, given the fact that we could not agree on the scope of work, we decided that our time was better spent on other initiatives. So I will be attending the Board of Health meeting on Monday, and we actually do have standing on the agenda after some requests for previous meetings. So what I believe to be the case, and I could probably better answer this question on Tuesday, is that there has been an RFP that's been designed by the wind developer that basically focuses on the general A weighting schemes that Mr. James has articulated. Does not focus on low frequency sound, infrasound, aerodynamic amplitude modulation, none of that. There has been a list of candidates from an engineering consultant perspective that have received this. I know that Mr. James' firm was one. And they chose not to participate as an engineering consultant for the reasons that we've already discussed. But there will be somebody that will be selected. They will undertake this limited scope. There will be a report that will be done. It's my expectation through that that report will come back favorable to the wind developer. And that will be the document that the Board of Health will utilize to make a decision. So that is our view on where it's going. I don't think there'll be anything fundamentally that will come out of Monday's Board of Health meeting that will change that message. And so we'll see where it all goes. Yes?
Hi, I'm Carrie Flynn from Gilson Road. Tom, thanks on behalf of the community for the efforts you and the others have done on this issue. I know we have an election coming up for selectmen in Scituate in April, and I would urge everyone to keep that in mind as you make your vote. But also, is there anything the rest of us can do to help other than, you know, attending town meetings, spreading the word?
So thank you, Carrie, for the question. So yes, the answer is unequivocally yes. We have a population here that I think largely has not had the opportunity to receive this level of information that you folks have received today. As I mentioned to you, we have these individual mics, such as the one that Jerry was outfitted with before he came to speak to us. And the reason for that is that this entire proceeding is being videotaped. And the utilization of that videotape will be on a YouTube loop, which we will share with everybody that was here today. I think everybody should have signed in. When you receive that YouTube loop, I strongly recommend that you share that with your friends and your neighbors and your loved ones who are residents of the town to allow them to better inform themselves on this particular issue. Make them aware of the petition to rescind the special permit. And I think you can now, with some information, describe to them why that is something that they should support. And then, you know, certainly we need every vote that we can possibly generate from the citizens of this town who are eligible to vote to support the rescission of that special permit with the mind eliminating the operation of this industrial wind turbine. So I think certainly as we move towards April the 9th, the next 2 to 3 weeks, that really is the focus. If I'm going to leave my business cards up on the table, but please grab one if you have any questions, any additional information that you need as a result of today's presentation or on town meeting. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me or to Jerry Kelly on that particular point. We'd be more than happy to have that conversation. We're going to be, in addition to that, working on a grassroots Get Out the Vote campaign, which we have more time to execute that than we had to get this together. I'm actually very pleased with the turnout today, given the limited window that we had to organize this. So again, we need to reach as many folks as we possibly can to deliver the message and garner their support. And certainly if they have any questions, concerns, on the other side of the discussion, we're more than happy to share accurate information with them so they can make a more informed decision on this topic. Yes?
2 questions. One, do we have any idea how much the town is making in terms of electrical power with this wind turbine? Because they're going to bring that up at town meeting, I'm sure. Or somebody will, you know, because that's going to be a balance, you know, as to how much money we're making or whatever.
The representations that we've consistently heard is that they expected an annual energy savings of $250,000 per year. And I expect that when a member of the towns ask that question, they will say that their expectation is that they'll have an annual energy savings of $250,000 per year. So,
do they have any figures yet?
They have a town operating budget that was released a few months ago that has a line item in there. We don't know how that was calculated. I think in all honesty, if it gets to this point, the only way that we're going to be able to accurately identify what the actual performance of this is and the savings to the town and so on and so forth is to hire an independent consultant to conduct an energy audit to audit those bugs. Jerry, do you have some more?
Yeah, just to elaborate upon that, the deputy town administrator stated that they will be within 10 or 20% of their savings, which means there'll be a 10 or 20% shortfall. And he said what everybody can do is pray for higher electricity rates, and that'll make it look better.
Yes, that was articulated at the last selectman meeting. Yes?
I would just like to make a comment. I think
Please.
we keep calling them green projects. They're not green because they're detrimental to health, to the flora and fauna as well. So maybe we should change the wording somehow and get away from the word green, because people always think healthy, and it's not.
So I think the phrase that we've embraced and espoused is that these are alternative energy installations. And I think if there's one key message that comes out of this is that certainly myself personally, and I know that the people that I've worked with closely on this share the same view. We are not opponents of alternative energy. We support alternative energy. We recognize that we need to deal with air quality emissions and carbon emissions and those sorts of things. And I think we all agree, if any of us spend any time in this, that there is a very important role for alternative energy in terms of the overall energy mix and our focus on energy defense and energy security and the like. However, as Dr. Silver pointed out in his talk, these have to be appropriately sited locations so they do not negatively impact the health and safety of folks in towns throughout America. You know, these are power plants. These are not windmills. These are power plants. They generate electricity. There's not a power plant of any other source that would be sited 650 feet from a residential home. This has negative health impacts as well, just different from a fossil fuel-based one. So I think our message is support alternative energy, but support the appropriate siting of alternative energy. Sir.
Yeah, Tom, just curious, you talked about the acoustical study that you guys couldn't agree on. You wanted a comprehensive acoustical study. They wanted to go with Plan B. I understood. What is the difference in cost? What does a comprehensive acoustical study cost?
Actually, it's a very good question because, you know, members of the town, senior officials of the town, will tell you that one of the reasons that they couldn't support the broader approach was that it was uneconomic. They couldn't afford it. There wasn't money in the budget. What's interesting is there was no effort to get any cost estimates on what a broader approach might be. I know certainly speaking with our friends in the acoustical engineering side, what we gathered was the cost increase would have been insignificant. So, you know, I spoke with a member of the media yesterday and we had this conversation, and, you know, that's the message coming from the town, is they can't afford it. And what I said to that particular reporter, who couldn't refute my statement, was there was no effort to determine what a cost would be for a broader acoustical study. There was no effort to get a budget identified for a shadow flicker study, and there was no effort to determine what the cost of the health questionnaire would be. The wind developer said, we're going to go with a basic, limited, A-weighting acoustical analysis. That's all we're prepared to do. We're not prepared to support shadow flicker analysis, and we're not prepared to support a health questionnaire. And the Board of Health joined in lockstep with the wind developer, and that's what they approved.
So the question I had, you didn't quite answer. I wanted to know how much a full-blown acoustical study would cost. That was the question. And the other question I have is, who's paying for the study?
So on the cost question, Joanne, do you have a bit more information on that?
Well, no. What I was going to say is, it was my understanding that in Scituate, written into the contracts was the fact that if there were any noise complaints, the wind developer would be responsible for paying for any acoustical studies to investigate that.
That is correct, and it's the wind developer's obligation to fund the study.
And that's in the special permit. The expectation, Joe, is to have the protocol that the wind developer and the Board of Health embraced. It's probably going to be a cost of $15,000 to $20,000. My guess is that they're going to use the same firm that did the feasibility study because they're going to be the lowest bid on it. To do it correctly and to do L90, Lmax, and LAV, it would be more money. It would probably be double or triple. But you're going to get the same data that you'll be able to go in and analyze there. LAV would have a jackhammer compliant in operation because it smooths the sound over a time period. Does that answer it, Joe?
Well, kind of does.
Okay.
It doesn't make sense that the wind developer would be paying for it, because if you hired me or anybody you hired somebody, they're going to support who's paying the bill.
Oh, that's
why
exactly
don't we
right.
have an independent study? And I'm not asking you, Tom, why you don't have one, but this should be a bigger question before the town, at least to have a fair study done to support the complaints and the pain that our neighbors are going through.
Right. So just on that point, Joe, as Jerry mentioned in his talk, is that the courts suggested to us that we should follow due process. Which includes going through this exercise of the limited acoustical study. That doesn't mean that we haven't considered, nor would we proceed with, on our own, a much broader approach such as we've espoused. That doesn't mean that at some point in time we may not decide to finance a shadow flicker analysis and engage somebody like Dr. Silver or somebody else to help with a health questionnaire on this particular topic. So that still remains on the table. You know, obviously, as a resident and taxpayer, you would hope that at some point in time, people that sit in a position of responsibility would do the right thing. And if they're not prepared to do the right thing, then we'll do the right thing.
Joe, the town has stated that they will not do it because they don't have the budget, and they will only do it if the developer pays for it. And the developer has stated that any study of shadow flicker is a witch hunt in which they will not engage.
That's why we need an independent study.
Margaret.
Do we actually know what the dB level of this plant is? You know, because Dr. James said, you know, between 40 and 50 there should be lawsuits. Do we actually know what that is?
So Rick, the question is, and I think I can answer the first part, is do we know what the actual dBA levels emanating off of that wind turbine are? The answer is not yet. Do you have, for similar environments of a turbine of that size and make, do you have any sort of general parameters that you could share with us in terms of what you feel the dBA level might be?
Well, as a general rule, at about 1,500 feet, a 1.5 megawatt turbine during the daytime will produce levels at around 40 decibels, 40, 45. And at nighttime, as the wind becomes a little less well-behaved at the blade height, that increases to 45 to 50. But again, we're only talking about the A-weighted levels, and that's not where the problem is. Like I said, we measured infrasound at 1.25 miles from a 1.5 or a 2.5 megawatt turbine operating at less than 10% capacity. That was well over 85 dB SPL. So A-weighted levels tend to be fairly repeatable. They're quieter in the day and they're noisier at night, and 40, 45 at 1,300 feet or so. Daytime, 45, 50 at night is common. And then you can just subtract 3 from that for every doubling of distance.
Sir.
Did the original studies as part of the permitting process reveal any of these risks? And did they show them, and if so, who reviewed them as part of the approval process?
The original studies did identify some of the risks and then said that the structure to be built would be compliant. They estimated that the shadow flicker would be compliant with the international standard of approximately 30 hours per year in the shadow flicker study, not 3 hours per day. It was Mass Technology Corporation, or I forget who it was that it was submitted to. But once again, it's what protocol do you use? And they use the LAV. And if you use the LAV, you're going to be compliant. They also studied 3 industrial wind turbines, General Electric, Siemens, and a third. And they installed Sinovel, which was not studied.
And that's a significant point.
Sinovel is a startup wind turbine company owned by the People's Republic of China that has installed 3 industrial wind turbines in the United States, 1 in Fairhaven, 1 in Scituate, and 1 somewhere else, all by the developer who is Celaya. They are also a party to a patent infringement lawsuit with a Massachusetts company that's in the Supreme Court in China right now.
Sir.
I think the relevant piece with that is that the acoustic characteristics of the blades from the different manufacturers vary greatly. So when you switch from one model to the next, it's not just the size, but it's the blade design and how it's operated that can make very large differences in the sound emissions.
Correct.
As part of the RFP process for the sound testing, people have requested that information from the manufacturer, and the responses come from the developer, Scituate Wind, that that's confidential proprietary information that they're unwilling to disclose.
And they have not been forced or pushed or encouraged, even for that matter, by either the Town Board of Health or town officials. Sir.
Yeah, a comment was made about noisier at night. From my perspective, my house, which faces the turbine directly, at about maybe 2,500 feet, I would agree with that. Sound is a jet high and just going away, and there may be that constant. Does wind direction and wind speed have anything to do with carrying this sound?
Rick, can you answer that question for us?
Yes, yes. Wind direction, wind speed can cause a variation of roughly 10 decibels, even if the sound being emitted by the turbine is the same. But if you get turbulent wind, which is common at night at the blade height, that can increase it anywhere from 6 to 15 decibels just by itself. So direction of the wind, condition and how smooth the wind is, all of these things are entering into the experience that people have when they're living downwind of a wind turbine.
So, thanks, Rick. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's now 4:15, so we've let the program go about 15 minutes beyond what we had targeted, but we appreciate your interaction and your questions and your comments. We've got the ability to get additional information to your folks and respond to other questions as they come to mind, so please don't think for a moment that the dialogue ends when we adjourn the meeting. But on behalf of the committee, your neighbors of the Scituate Turbine, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us today. I'd like to specifically mention Michelle Banning, who's at the back of the room, who, for those of you who don't know, has been responsible for all of the high quality media communications that this group has generated. I think you all owe her a high level of appreciation. Linda Alvarez, who has worked, actually she was one of the leaders with David Darty on this well before I got involved, who's been at the registration desk. Linda, if you'd be kind enough to stand up and take a bow. Of course, Mr. Jerry Kelly, who, as you probably have gathered, has generated a bit of information and done a wee bit of due diligence on this particular matter and has been a marvelous resource. Lori Perry, who worked very closely with us on mail drops and helping to get the word out for this event. Lori, if you'd stand up to be recognized. Michelle Fox, who's a neighbor of this town, hasn't been on Third Cliff as long as I have, but has jumped in both feet as a neighbor and a friend and is responsible for helping us organize this marvelous video presentation that we're going to be able to enjoy. Michelle, just thank you very much. And of course, Joanne Levesque, who is not a member of the town, not a resident of the town, but has been fighting and living this matter in other communities in the South Shore for quite some time and has been an invaluable resource for us. And we've actually welcomed her in to our big tent here in this community, and we owe Joanne a debt of gratitude, and she is a face that you'll continue to see. So Joanne, thank you very, very much. So that's it, folks. I appreciate your time on a Saturday, available for questions, and we'll look forward to seeing you at Town Meeting.